It is Saturday, January the 11th, 2020. This is the Distant Peasant Podcast, and I am your host, Jeff in Georgia. On today's show, living in the fumes of the war machine. Yeah, that's right, I had something else planned for my next episode, related more to domestic politics. But events hath overtaken me, so I took the time to jot down some thoughts about recent developments regarding foreign policy in the United States. But of course, before I get to all of that, just a brief reminder that this show, like all of these shows, is brought to you by listeners like you. Listeners who have gone to patreon.com/distantpeasant have become recurring donors for as little as $1 a month. I'd like to wish each and every one of my listeners, and especially supporters, a Happy New Year. Good to see you on the other side. We are still chugging along here at distantpeasant.com. If you're interested in perusing my Twitter fights, you can check me out at JeffHisDudeness. Anyone who wants to argue with me about how important it is to spread the word that the guy that we just assassinated was super bad, feel free to hit me up. I'm down to fight with you about that all day, every day. And hopefully after today's show, you will understand a little bit why. I'm going to be kind of jumping all over the place a bit, I guess, but who cares? It's my show. So I'll say what I please. Long ago and far away from us, the Roman Republic dominated vast territories across Europe, Africa, Asia, the whole Mediterranean world. Well before the Roman government was graced by an Augustus, even well before Julius Caesar was even a twinkle in his father's eye, the Romans had conquered vast swaths of territory for direct rule, and had been enjoying the fruits of successful military campaigns for centuries. Carthage and their Hannibal, the Greeks and their Pyrrhus, the cunning Mithridates who could speak all 22 of the languages of the nations under his banner, Vercingetorix, the great warrior king of the divided Gallic tribes he desperately tried to unite before their final Roman conquest, all these and more fell under the yoke of Rome when it was yet a republic. The republic's military machine had evolved with the times, their tactics and equipment and logistics forged first in the fires of existential struggle for survival, for the early Romans were surrounded by other powers richer and mightier than they at first. And then increasingly, that machine cut its teeth on not just the petty kings and chiefs of the surrounding lands, but on the ancient Mediterranean's most powerful political units of the day. The Roman Republic pushed outward even up to the roof of the world, to the islands of Britannia in the north and the endless forests of Germania, to the endless sea beyond the Straits of Hercules to the west. Only in the east where they faced the Parthians, heirs to the old Persian Empire, were their ambitions checked. This was a kingdom too rich and powerful to steamroll for the moment, as doing so would require traipsing across huge amounts of land, much of it mountainous or desert, filled with incredibly unfriendly native populations, and with a motivated professional crack army harrying you the whole way. But my point is this. While there's more than one good way to describe how the Romans lost their republic with its laws and sacred customs and even elections, and how they became instead an empire, one goodish way is through the lens of that war machine of theirs that was so successful, and the resulting changes in society and culture it wrought over the centuries. There was the vast expansion of slavery-based agriculture and land consolidation resulting from all these stellar victories abroad and the resulting wealth inequality. Soldiers and veterans who wanted good farming land often failed to get it, and every attempt at land reform was opposed absolutely by the ruling class, with measures up to and including the employment of violent mobs. So as the Romans began to run out of peoples to conquer and kingdoms to loot and external enemies to unite them, they began to spend more and more of their time suppressing massive slave revolts, or even fighting each other. If the man you fought for could give you land that you held in your name and could pass on as a legacy to your children, so be it. Gods judge you for making war upon your fellow Romans, for wanting what nearly everyone wants. The war machine was a living thing. Its appetite for blood was cultivated over centuries as it labored. First in defense of the city and peoples who created it, then in conquest on behalf of them, then through civil wars, as it ate away the last vestiges of the proudly Republican Romans, who once boasted that they would never suffer the rule of a king. They would be ruled by an emperor instead, eventually, with power from the gods and from the armies of the earth. The Divine Augustus, he was called. There's no need to talk about any stuffy old emperors when talking about imperial domination for the Romans. The Roman Republic's military was the best around in its day. It was the pride of their civilization, one of the few reliable-ish avenues for advancement in their world. It made the expansionist republic possible, and it ultimately destroyed it. In the eyes of the chroniclers of the times, sympathizers with the traditionalist, socially conservative aristocrats of the ancient world to a man, it was all a consequence of a decline in ancient Roman virtues, the degradation of the ancient profession of farming, the increasingly flagrant disregard for law and custom by men with armies at their backs, the collapse of what passed for family values in the day, in short, the rise of a new Roman, with a greater appreciation than ever before that was Rome's war machine that held the keys to the halls of power. And the men who constituted that machine, with all the killing they did as a matter of occupation, became ever more admired by ever more people. Look no further than the sacred and fanatical devotion the Romans showed to their legionary standards, items they saw as very real embodiments of their worth as a people. Look at what they would do to keep them, and what they would give to get them back. That's not much of a materialist explanation, so its utility will be forever limited by this, and by our distance from the time and place in question, and it's justifiably dismissed. The origins of the late Roman Republic's fall, such as it is, should not be searched for in the minds of men. Very true. But the literate and high-class writers of the era did have some sort of point, I think. Their exaggerations and propaganda notwithstanding, I do think they sensed a change in the air. A fact left unchanged by their readiness to regard it as a snitch and dramatize their distaste for it, and muddle together what was foul with what just threatened their place in the world. Now, the Roman Republic as a vehicle for liberty, as we understand it today, is highly questionable. Yet this concept was ever on the minds of the people who devised the mechanisms of the United States government. They looked on the Roman Republic with far more admiration than I do, considering how things ended for it, morphing into an empire as it did, and then disintegrating slowly. Something broadly similar to this may yet befall the United States' empire, and much faster than we think, thanks to the rapid pace of technological change. But the technical specifications of any war machines, whether Roman or American, are not really what interests me. What interests me is that I, too, sense some changes in the air in our society, and I, too, think them foul. The cult of the warrior is on the rise in America, and it has been for a while, in ever more peculiar ways. since the Soviet Union ceased to be an effective foil for the story, though that's kind of a tale for another day. Our enemies are more varied now, less powerful but more numerous, and are given reasons for hostility ever more numerous and less convincing. Now, reasons for that violence have always been in the service of empire, since well before anyone listening to this podcast was born, I'm sure. But at least the Soviets actually had nuclear weapons and were a somewhat hostile superpower to the United States. Of course, its dissolution left a vacuum, culturally at least, into which the Taliban's Afghanistan and Saddam Hussein's Iraq eventually seeped, both successfully sold to us as enemies requiring the presence of our war machine. The powers that be have tried with others too. The Korean Peninsula and both Central and South America come to mind. But most recently, the warmongers have involved Iran through the recent political assassination of General Soleimani and several others outside Baghdad's airport recently. Count me among the doves, of course. Now, I've got doubts about whether Uncle Sam could even get to Tehran if he tried, but I think he'd suffer tremendous casualties either way. I don't know much about General Soleimani. I'm told he was an evil man out to hurt my country, though it is curious to me no one seemed to be concerned enough to talk much about that until after he was dead. He was a general in a military and security apparatus. It's not a common thing to be, but the world is full of such creatures. All are in the business of shedding blood to various degrees. Some of them are opposed to the United States, like Soleimani. His goodness or the goodness of his side was never in question, though he was a massively popular figure throughout Iran and parts of the Middle East, which means even that read looks pretty slim to me. What's in question is whether the United States government should have the privilege to decide whether such men live or die. The world is full of people. Many of them might be considered evil by some. A few of them might even muster the resources to commit great violence. Shall the United States government kill them all? Who shall decide when we are through and have no enemies left, and can turn instead to restoring the lives of all those we deem good? This attack has made plenty more enemies, people who will understandably nurse their hatreds and perhaps one day act upon them, likely directed at our imperial interests and client states in the region. It's so simple to imagine, it's a wonder no one with any power seems to imagine it. The war machine's stench is partly to blame. For us today, I don't need to go back to the American Revolution or the Civil War, World War I or II, or even the end of the Cold War. The present stank of our situation is varied because it's an amalgamation, but we need not start at anything like the beginning to get a modern understanding. Media is faster now, more forgettable, and even the best stuff tends to touch you for just a moment, makes you think just a bit, and then your world resumes pretty much the same as before. The effects of the war machine's exhaust on us decay over time, slowly at first and then faster and faster. Thus it's in need of constant renewal. The Super Bowl's entertainment in 2002, the 36th game if you're counting such things, was a great renewal of that machine, an event surrounded by its powerful stench. What else in media is more appealing and marketable to the broadest possible American audience than the Super Bowls? It's an event that's long transcended football, a social event, an annual milestone, with spectacle and wonderment to please even those uninterested in sport. This was the nation's first Super Bowl ever to be played in February, the terrorist attacks of a few months past having altered the football schedule. And what would come to be an overlooked sign of the future, the former head of the CIA, an organization engaged in perpetual war if ever there was one, he was there to participate in the coin toss between the two teams, though he was being honored as such because he was a former president of the United States, not the country's chief spy. The pregame entertainment featured past and present football players reading stirring excerpts from the Declaration of Independence, and every living U.S. president save Reagan made an appearance by videotape. Nancy stood in Ronald's stead. Paul McCartney from the Beatles, of course, was the highlight of the pregame music, performing an original song he composed in between the September 11, 2001 attacks and February 2002, called Freedom. Ain't much to read into the lyrics. Quote, "This is my right, a right given by God, to live a free life, to live in freedom. Talking about freedom, I'm talking about freedom. I will fight for the right to live in freedom. Anyone tries to take it away, you'll have to answer, because this is my right." End quote. Beautiful stuff. Already our enemies want to take away our freedom, and already violence is on the table. The halftime show was a bit different. Some clickbait articles are still out there on the internet, yearning to convince the world that the Irish rock band U2's 2002 show was the best Super Bowl halftime show in history. They played a 3-song set, Beautiful Day, for a dance merrily in the face of death sort of feel. MLK, a short and sincere elegy towards exactly who you'd assume. And finally, Where the Streets Have No Name, as a sort of mournful expression of loss for the thousands of deaths in the World Trade Center, complete with names and finishing with Bono flashing open his jacket to reveal an American flag printed on the inside. The musician in me can't help but concede that this is indeed how you build a set list, how you put on a show. Yet the sincere place it came from, the sincere feelings it generated, the incredibly strong emotional reactions it invoked, so much earnest sweetness and patriotic fervor, it was all just so much exhaust from a war machine revving up. In fact, tracking the next few Super Bowls entertainment elements is kind of telling as to where things were going in a certain sense. 2003's entertainment was far less memorable, but it did feature a rendition of God Bless America, the first and only time that song has ever been sung for the Super Bowl. The United States Navy performed a flyover with 18 jets that year, and the Dixie Chicks sang the national anthem. Later, they will face the wrath of millions of patriotic Americans, a goodly number of whom probably watched them perform in this very moment, for expressing opposition to George W. Bush's designs for war in Iraq. Next year, 2004, Janet Jackson's Boob made an appearance. Most people probably remember that one. While that would seem to have little to do with the war machine, it was such an inconsequential yet endlessly talked about event that I can't help but believe that many people preferred it to reality in some sense, to the hypercharged patriotism of the moment. The war machine had passed the event horizon, driven most of all by its own manufactured reality, and not by popular will. The havoc it was wreaking would wreck, still wrecks, is not controllable. Can we not at least control the display of obscenity at this, what passes for the last shared cultural experience as Americans we have? The year after that, 2005, featured a combination of the choirs of the U.S. Military Academy, the U.S. Naval Academy, the U.S. Air Force Academy, and the Coast Guard Academy, accompanied by the professionals of the U.S. Army Herald Trumpets. You get the picture. I describe this all as foul exhaust, all this pomp and patriotic fervor, because it wasn't just hiding massive amounts of death and destruction throughout Iraq and Afghanistan, but encouraging that death and destruction. People didn't just accept it, although some people did just accept it. Others embraced it. Though, of course, more was going to be needed than grand appeals to patriotism and defending freedom, surrounded by soldiers in their dress uniforms. For people looking for more sober analysis and reasoning, in the years during and immediately after the Bush presidency, it was common to pin much of the war machine's stench on a group called neoconservatives. These highly educated creatures of the right with a near religious devotion to war as a tool, as a way of communicating, as an end to itself. My purpose in mentioning them is not to describe and critique their ideology in detail. It's just to do two things. First, to say that it was their arguments, so serious, so sophisticated, so alarming to people, that were to sway the smarter rubes of the United States. Secondly, and more importantly, they still live, in the Republican Party. And it was and is quite fashionable to cast them as the villains of the story and expose them to all the examinations of motive and means imaginable. That's all well and good, but goes only so far. It shouldn't distract us from what happened when such men were out of the halls of power, or from the large number of Democrats, not neoconservatives, who voted in favor of their projects over time. Democrats, when they took control of both houses of Congress in 2006, made no moves to defund the wars or unwind American empire in any substantial way, nor did they attempt to publicize effectively or hold accountable Bush administration officials who knew, or should have known, that what they were telling the American public about why Iraq needed invading was bullshit. When Barack Obama assumed office, beating Hillary Clinton for the nomination by and large because he had not supported the Iraq War, the Democrats increased their margins in both the House and the Senate, and there were no neoconservatives around to blame for public policy anymore at all, really. Those Democrats never really withdrew from the conflict, though the vast majority of military personnel were finally finished coming home around 2012 from Iraq. Some troops remain there even as I write this, as well as a shitload of military contractors and a gigantic embassy of ours that was recently overrun. Iraq as our client state and within our sphere of influence, this never really changed. Still, I guess Obama does deserve a little bit of credit for steadily and slowly reducing our military presence there and attempting to reach some sort of accord with Iran, Iraq's very large and powerful neighbor. As for Afghanistan, though, uniformed military presence rose from less than 40,000 in 2009 to a peak of about 100,000 in 2011, according to the Department of Defense's own sources anyway. This represents a huge reinvestment in American imperial influence in the region. None of this was driven by any neoconservatives. It was driven by what passes for liberals within the massive security state of America, headed by our first black president in history, swept into office on the tide of massive resentment over Republican wars, and domestic policies too, for that matter. But in neither of those spheres, neither foreign or domestic, did Democrats ever properly address these resentments. No justice was ever done, nor was anyone who lost what they shouldn't have ever made whole. As I record this today, things have quieted some massive popular anger over the killing of the Iranian military's MVP, a man who seemed to have been in the middle of playing peacemaker between his government and our men in Saudi Arabia when he was killed. This still persists. The Iranian government has responded with missile attacks upon U.S. bases in Iraq. Thankfully, there seem to have been no casualties, and our big wet president doesn't seem over-eager to seize upon the latest tit for another tat. There is the case of an airliner that went down shortly after takeoff from Tehran, around the same time as the Iranians triggered their response. This was originally reported to be an accident by both Iranian and U.S. officials. Since then, U.S. officials have reversed themselves and say the Iranians accidentally blew it up themselves. After some denial, the Iranians did admit this, though I do know that the people who would seize upon such an event to encourage an escalation of what is already a de facto lukewarm war should not be trusted in the United States. The war machine's odor permeates everything, even things that actually happen. Every event is seen as the latest in a series of signs, possible threats, signals requiring a response. The war machine is attempting to tumble forward on its own momentum, trying to get up enough speed so that it becomes unstoppable, at least until it crashes upon the mountains of Iran. In the meantime, it will seize upon whatever facts it can, be they true or false, to encourage violence. The machine is alive. It makes money, and if it stops moving, stops eating, it will die. Must I really argue that there is no solution for us but to dismantle this machine as peacefully as possible? That there should be no more talk of a properly calibrated and directed and legal war machine? I laugh when I hear people compare the media environment today regarding Iran and the United States possibly going to war with 2003's environment. Not because the environment is different, I laugh because it isn't just comparable. In many cases, it's exactly the same. Many of the same names of men who designed and executed U.S. policy in Iraq, or cheered it on at least, during our latest imperial follies there, they are still appearing on television. Their names still being quoted in the papers. Names like Paul Wolfowitz, Ken Pollock, Brett Stevens, to give but 3 examples. These all enthusiastically supported the Iraq War and are just as excited about a new one. There are other less ridiculous figures too, true. They have titles like former intelligence analyst or regional expert. All of them are nonetheless eager to point out that the man who the United States government just assassinated was a really, really bad guy. If there's one thing I want you to take away from me today, it is this. Accepting such a framing, whether such a man was good or evil, whether he deserved death or not, is foolish. Certainly the truth is more complicated than that. These are struggles of a nationalist flavor between the United States and Iran, and each side is the protagonist of their own great patriotic story. But there is no need to understand the details of any of that to grasp what's important about the subject at hand. Whether this man deserved death, that ship has sailed. No amount of artful dancing and prancing about the blood on his hands, allegedly, can change the fact that the set list is out of order. That these idiots are playing the 3rd movement of a symphony before the 1st. What this political assassination really was about was sending a message. The war machine knows no language better than violence. And the message is that it's willing to do more, go further, be harder. Our nice embassy was overrun, so we kicked things up about 10 notches and murked the Iranian military's most beloved general. Wasting breath talking of the alleged crimes of that general is a consequence of breathing in the war machine's intoxicating exhaust. One that only ever leads to 3 certainties: that the war machine is American, that the war machine's enemies are evil, and that the destruction of evil enemies is good. Quibbling about the timing, or manner, or degree of justification for that destruction is missing the point. Imperial war is not a court of law. So much erudite analysis and sophisticated study is every bit as substantive as those patriotic Super Bowl acts. They are propped up by the war machine itself, and whether the source is high or low, whether it's cheesy calls to national service or maudlin patriotic gestures from Paul McCartney, or sophisticated analysis from Ivy League university graduates with years of experience working in and around the area, the message's aim is always the same. Feed the machine, and don't feel too bad about it. This feeding may be relished, or accepted, or grimly tolerated. At the extreme end, perhaps we could talk about the machine being recalibrated to require less feeding, or we might be more careful as to who is fed to it and how. But dismantling it and turning on a fan to clear its putrid exhaust. What, don't you know how bad the Iranian General Soleimani was? Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Just had to get some of that off my chest because I do not want a war. With anyone, really. But especially not Iran. Don't forget patreon.com/dissidentpeasant. Check out my website at dissidentpeasant.com. Check me out on Twitter at JeffSDunas. You can find me on YouTube, Stitcher, iTunes. Just look for Dissident Peasant. I will see you